Welcome everybody to the annual general meeting of the Right to Quiet Society for Soundscape Awareness and Protection. We acknowledge that we're operating on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Welcome all members, supporters, and guests. Just a quick introduction. Myself, John Martin, as president, and Carl Rabb is vice president. Nicole Pan in Victoria is our secretary treasurer. And we've got Jeanine Botta in New York, media coordinator, and Elvira Lount in Vancouver, a director, and Arline Bronzaft, director as well in New York. What we will do is we'll have the speakers and topics. We have three wonderful speakers this evening. Looking forward to that. Carl will be introducing those and giving them a brief biography. Afterwards, we will take a discussion and questions for our speakers. We'll have a short break and ask guests to depart, and then we will have members only, where we will have a nominations for the board 2023, the induction of board voting and the induction of board directors, and then questions and approval of directors and conclusion of the meeting. Carl, I'll pass it over to you to get our speaker session started.
Well, thank you. The invitation actually listed the title and the speaker's bios. I wasn't really prepared for this. We have three very competent speakers. Two of them are present directors, and a third one we will probably have as a director after this meeting. Jeanine Botta from New York City has been with us for about 10 years or so, a little more than 10 years. And she is an authority on all kinds of noise issues. I won't try to describe all the things that she has been working on for us and for other groups as well. Arline is a renowned scientist of the effects of noise on health, and she has the reputation worldwide, and we're very proud that she's part of our direction. And David Sadoway is an urban planner and professor at Quantum Polytechnic University, and he has studied various environmental issues in many countries around the world, and has an interest in noise, which is helping us. And the title of their presentation, I don't have in front of me, but Jeanine will read the title because it's rather long. So thank you.
The title is Panacea or Pipe Dream: Challenges and Opportunities in Noise Camera Implementation. And we might each have our own subtitles.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Arline?
Yes.
I think you're first.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
We can.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to give an overall view of how we're attempting to assess noise impacts so that we can actually come up with solutions to remedy them. My first study on the effects of noise on children's learning, when a school was adjacent to an elevated train track and the noise from the trains disrupted the classroom teaching and learning every 4.5 minutes, was looked at as a possible study to demonstrate adverse impacts of noise on learning. So I looked at the reading scores of the children in those classrooms, and the teachers were disturbed by the noise as well, and compared the reading scores to children on the quiet side of the building. No surprise that by the 6th grade, the children adjacent to the trains were nearly a year behind in reading compared to children on the quiet side. What followed is really remarkable, that this study was published in an academic journal, that it received wide press and media, that public officials, New Yorkers all looked at the results because children were being affected by the noise. The remarkable thing is how quickly New York remedied the problem. We were able to persuade the transit authority to test out a method that they were exploring on quieting track noise, to use that next to the school. And we got the Board of Ed to put acoustical ceilings in the classrooms. Those two noise abatements considerably reduced the noise in the classrooms. And then I'm going to say, well, what do you think happened? Did the children do better? The answer is the children on both sides of the building were then able to read at the same level, and that paper was published. Those are two early landmark studies in the field. What I want to focus on is the remedy. Notice how quickly they were able to reduce the noise adjacent to, the track noise adjacent to the school. Notice how they got acoustical ceilings in. And this was done over 40 years ago. So that basically what I find is that when you look at noise impacts and you identify the sources, you really can come up with remedies to lessen the noise. If we could do that 45 years ago, what about today? And I'm talking about aircraft noise. I'm talking about vehicle noise. I'm talking about construction noise. The problem is not the ways to reduce the noise. The problem is the will to do it. And I've written papers on that. So then when we look at vehicle noise, we're looking at cars that are zooming down the streets and with souped up vehicles. These are souped up vehicles disturbing people. Why can't we monitor the cars, identify them, give them a penalty, and try to reduce the noise? What follows often is that laws are passed to at least identify the cars, give them penalties, and hopefully reduce the noise. But the important thing about laws being passed is they must be enforced. And that's where we have problems. And that's worldwide. We pass laws, but how do we enforce them? In the United States, it's generally police departments that are supposed to enforce the laws. Unfortunately, they don't get enforced. And as I once said to Mayor Bloomberg, when he updated the noise code, if we don't enforce it, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And that's the problem we have when it comes to laws dealing with vehicle noise. We have to try to catch the people, depend on police departments, and it hasn't worked. So recently, they've come up with another remedy. Why not have a noise camera similar to a speed camera? So when the car with its souped up motor and engine passes a point, that car's license plate will be identified and the meter will register the decibel level. that car will be penalized, and hopefully the word will get out that if you are using your car to intrude on the peace and quiet of people in the neighborhood, you're going to suffer a penalty. And so what has happened is cities in Europe, in Canada, in the United States have come up with a design to identify the vehicles that are going through our streets, driving everyone crazy. In fact, I believe in Canada, a number of years ago, a study was done to try to use a vehicle to trace the noisy ones coming down the street. But apparently it didn't work and it was abandoned. In Paris, in London, and other cities in Europe, they are doing pilot studies to come up with ways to catch these vehicles. They have to pay a fine, and hopefully it will reduce the numbers of such vehicles on the streets. In New York City, we have a pilot study. Vehicles are being identified. They are receiving penalties, but we have not yet had a report on how successful the program has been. In fact, some of the early pilot studies in Europe were not successful because if a car is going through on a roadway, going through a corner, and there's another car or vehicle nearby, the meter has to be careful to only pick up the vehicle that's very loud, but it also could pick up some of the sound of the nearby car. So you have to design things very carefully. The wonderful thing about the study I did all those years ago is that fortunately the design worked. The results were solid. They've been confirmed by many more studies, and remedies were put in place. At this point, we have not yet come up with a report to demonstrate how successful these pilot studies have been. I have to now say I'm still an academic. I'm still a researcher. And to me, you have to show me the data, show me how the data have confirmed the hypothesis you've designed, and then we can move forward. So overall, right now, we are in the process of examining how we can catch these noisy vehicles with a noise camera similar to a camera that has picked up people who've got cars that have gone through red lights. But we haven't gotten the definitive studies yet that confirm that this method indeed has worked, picked up violators, and very important, it must also deter other cars from doing this. So you must keep a record of how many violations have been issued. And if after a few years there's been a decrease, then you can confirm the procedure you put in place has indeed lessened the noise on the streets. So I'm going to turn over to the next two speakers to talk more specifically about the programs. Thank you very much.
Can noise cameras save our sleep? I'm starting off with a pop quiz. Tell me or think to yourself, what would be the best solution for these vehicle noise scenarios? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we have 4 scenarios here. One of them is a chronic, predictable horn honking at the intersection of 2 very busy urban roads. Another one is medallion, taxi, and livery cars. Livery cars are cars that you have to call for car service. And vans drive along busy urban streets, honking their horns at pedestrians in order to solicit fares. And they're also using very high-pitched air horns as they're doing this. And a group of motorcyclists driving past homes along a state road overnight, all night, different groups with loud modified mufflers. And finally, drivers are drag racing on a pier in an industrial neighborhood where the noise can be heard blocks away. But it's the kind of a mixed neighborhood where you'll be in the industrial section and then you'll walk a half a block and you'll start to be in the residential section. So it's not really separated from the people who actually live there, and they cross over. And the drivers who are drag racing are also doing things like maybe driving up on the sidewalk, something like that. So the list of potential solutions, and one of these is a joke, but the list of potential solutions is noise cameras, educational noise display. Those are the big ones that are electronic. They're very big, and they will sometimes have decibel numbers or the number of miles per hour. A standard regulatory sign, such as a sign that says no honking, $350 fine. A citizen science app. For our purposes, that would be the reported app that can report driving infractions. Citizen arrest, legislative action. When I say legislative action, I'm thinking also in terms of an elected leader deciding to get involved and do some outreach or have his or her office do outreach. Educational outreach, code enforcement intervention, and law enforcement intervention. There's an overlap with code enforcement and law enforcement, but often with a code enforcement team, they might have a code enforcer, they might have a social worker, they might have a police officer. It's not as contentious an interaction as you would have with law enforcement, and there might be follow-up that's almost like social work. So the way I got involved with noise activism was around 2011. I didn't own a car at that. I don't think I owned a car at that point. And I realized that people were, that the cars were set up so that people would honk their horn, or the key fob would honk the horn whenever people were simply locking their car. And I thought that was the most outrageous thing I had ever heard of in my life. And I had been more and more with an open window at night, hearing these people honking these short honks. And I had thought, well, maybe they're getting caught when they're getting out. They're getting caught somehow and they're accidentally honking. But then I found out what it was. And I also realized that people were sometimes doing it from their house. Like, even if the car was parked in front of your house, they would honk the horn in front of their house, because more and more as they got used to it, they needed to hear that honk. So this got me involved, and I started asking, does my senator know about this? Does this person know about this? Is somebody working on this? And that's how I ended up meeting Arline. She didn't have any good news whatsoever. And then about 6 years later, 5 or 6 years later, the way I became interested in noise cameras, and noise cameras would never have helped me with that original irritant. I moved to a neighborhood where there was something called a dollar van. There were also taxis, there were also livery cars, and they would drive along these very beautiful, lush green roads, following pedestrians around and honking at them. And that was pretty irritating. I spoke to my state senator, and he actually immediately wrote a letter to the owners of these companies. I only stayed there 2 years, and then I moved down to Brooklyn, central Brooklyn. And in central Brooklyn, this is where I really first saw the dollar van. And dollar vans are often illegal. They don't even have plates. They drive around honking at pedestrians, just constantly honking at pedestrians, using the air horns. And it's not just them, it's also the medallion drivers and the livery drivers as well. It's what they're doing is illegal in many different ways. And for some reason, someone introduced himself to me and told me that he was trying to get DEP to look at his noise cameras. So we talked about it, and I thought, wow, this might be a good way to address this issue. So let me move on for a minute. Okay, so I got an idea. I was in a graduate program for public health. And what I thought, and my city council member had a good relationship with the dollar van drivers. He had their back. He did things for them. So I thought I would approach him and suggest to him that we kind of do a public health intervention where we educate the drivers that honking at pedestrians isn't good for the pedestrians, it isn't good for them. I understand that it's a cultural norm, but it wasn't always a cultural norm, and it does bother a lot of people. And I thought maybe just a sort of an educational program where we could talk to them. And I also thought it might be a good idea to look into putting the signs back up, because a lot of the drivers thought that since the signs were taken down, the no honking signs, that meant that you can honk. But it went nowhere, because like a lot of elected leaders in my particular district, he didn't believe in noise as being a bad thing. So I kept the idea of the noise cameras in my mind, and I started talking to people about them, and interviewing some people that were involved in the work of doing pilot studies. So the benefits of incorporation of noise cameras can be noise reduction, automated ticketing that can reduce or eliminate encounters with law enforcement, deterrent effects if drivers are aware of the cameras. In some instances, it may encourage self-regulation, although that might be more in terms of when noise cameras are used outside of venues that have entertainment. And the Viginoise company that we spoke with and met with has different kinds of uses for noise cameras. So that's one of them. And it can also be a source of revenue. And challenges with noise cameras. And I got these a little bit with some of my reading, but also my discussion with the manager of the automated enforcement with the Edmonton Office of Traffic up in Alberta. And also with recent discussion with Raphael, who's in charge of international relations and business inquiries with Viginoise, which is a subsidiary of Brut Parif. Brut Parif is a nonprofit, a government-funded agency that deals with noise, which we don't really seem to have that here. So the challenges can be that the collection of data has to be consistently, absolutely able to stand up in court if necessary. There were instances of vandalism with the equipment, so the equipment had to be changed and fortified. There were objections from some people about creating what they call a culture of too much surveillance. There were theories about the technology being able to target groups, specific groups. Now, with this one, the one about targeting specific groups, a report came out within the last several months stating that almost 50% of the people who get caught by speed cameras don't live in the area. So they are random, they could be from anywhere. So that kind of suggests that the idea of targeting a group by setting up a noise camera or a speed camera in a location, this doesn't hold water, because the people that are getting caught don't necessarily live there. They're not targeted people, they're random people driving through. Another challenge is that the educational display units can lead to a competition to make noise. Both Raphael and Rajna described instances where people on the streets and people in cars would rev their motors. They try to bring the decibel number as high as they possibly could. Some people would scream at them, and the people in the nearby residents were being driven out of their minds. They tried to cap it, I think, at 90 decibels, which really doesn't sound very effective. And what Raphael said was that local legislation conflicts with the ability to test some of the technology, and that's the greatest challenge that they face. Okay, so this one I had mixed feelings about. The signs and displays which they'll have on the road, not necessarily the electronic displays, but just regular signage. They'll warn drivers that there are noise cameras ahead, which makes you think, well, why are you warning them? I want them to get ticketed. But maybe it's better to warn them, because maybe then they'll stop, at least for the while that they're going past a certain place, and you would hope that the place they're going past is a place where people can stay asleep, rather than just an empty place. Another challenge, if some people will know about this, is an app called Waze. And with the Waze app, it will simply tell you if there's a if there's a speed camera, if there's a noise camera, if there are police, where exactly the police are. So it basically warns people, drivers. I've also met and spoken with people they came to another presentation of mine, and they wanted to talk about their problem. And their problem was that people were hanging out on their front stoop. They would call the police, and then the people would have their Waze apps, and they could tell when the police were coming close, so they would get quieter. So some of these apps can actually be a bit of a nightmare. I just want to mention that this is the Citizen app that I was mentioning. It's called the Reported app. I really hate this. I don't like seeing taxi drivers demonized, and I don't even like seeing this image, but it has something, it has some verbiage here that I think is good news. It says a new study by the 4-year-old smartphone tool shows that 96% of drivers who get a complaint about their driving, which could include honking, they don't get a second one. And the designer of this, he's a co-designer, Jeff, was inspired to do this because he hates honking. He was hearing honking in his Upper West Side neighborhood, and he entered another contest before he created this app. So he designed it so that it could, there'll be a multitude of laws that taxi drivers can break, and you take out your app, you record what's happening. You don't have to record it with a video, but you can. But you basically type up what happened, you get their license, you describe it, and you send it electronically. It goes to the city agency TLC, Taxi and Limousine Commission. And what happens then is that TLC notifies the driver. The driver has the option to go to court or pay the fine. And Jeff told me that most of the drivers pay the fine, which is incredible. The fact that most of them pay the fine and 96% of them don't get a second complaint is really good news. And I think that this app could be modified to deal with dense roads that have lots of pileups and stuff like that, where drivers are honking for hours on end. I think having peace officers, a few police, and some citizen scientists to do this could alleviate this problem. The only downside with the Reported app is that it is registered to you, so your name is on it. You so far you can't be anonymous. So I'm going to get back to the pop quiz solutions. With the horn honking at the intersection of two busy urban roads, I thought that these 5 solutions were the best solutions. That's a standard regulatory sign right there. The citizen science app I just showed you, if that were altered to deal with noise, noise only, and all cars, not just taxis, I think it could really help. Educational outreach, I think, is important. Code enforcement intervention, which is different from law enforcement intervention and involves more of more education and more like follow-up with people. And then again, I think that there could always be law enforcement there, but they should be like the food pyramid. I would put law enforcement at the very top because it's the smallest amount there. So that's what I would have suggested for this. With a scenario with the medallion and livery cars and vans driving along the streets, honking at pedestrians to solicit fares, I think that the standard regulatory signs have to go back up. They were taken down a few years ago. They were saying they were by bicycle people, I think. They were saying they were causing clutter, if you can believe that. And in my neighborhood, when I've spoken with taxi and medallion and livery drivers and dollar vans and said, don't you know it's against the law to honk at people, they all across the board would say, they took the signs down, that law doesn't exist anymore. They're actually breaking at least three laws when they honk at people, when they use air horns. They're not supposed to solicit fares, so that they're breaking at least 3 laws, and they don't even think they're breaking one. Okay, so a standard regulatory sign, citizen scientist app, educational outreach, code enforcement intervention, and possibly a little bit of law enforcement intervention. This cartoon is from the New Yorker. I just couldn't fit that word in. I probably shouldn't be using it without permission, but anyway. And oh, wait, did I? Oh. I neglected to get my motorcycle image. I'm sorry, guys. But this is accurate. So, okay, for the groups of motorcycles driving past homes along a state road overnight every night with loud modified mufflers, the noise camera really fits well here. Because I think it fits well here better than in most of the crowded urban areas, although I do think that eventually they might be good enough to be able to try them there. And I do think they should be piloted all over, not just in specific situations. But for this one, these motorcycle drivers are on these quiet state roads going very far. They'll pass little towns and hamlets. And if there's a noise camera right before you're going to pass a hamlet or a small town where people are sleeping, they will either get ticketed or their Waze app will let them know, or a sign will let them know, and they will quiet down. So then they will be able to go past people's houses and hopefully not wake them up. For some reason, I still think that a law enforcement intervention occasionally would be helpful here. Some people might disagree with me. Finally, the drivers drag racing on a pier in an industrial neighborhood where noise can be heard in residents' homes blocks away. This is absolutely across the board. You do not try anything else. Don't try citizen science. Just call 911. This is a law enforcement issue. This is really, really dangerous. And also in these neighborhoods, yes, they might have segregated themselves to a pier and be doing most of their drag racing there, but they're also driving around the neighborhood because the streets are rather empty in these industrial places, especially at night. But people do work there. People work there. Some people live very close by. People live on the side streets. So there's a danger of them hurting someone. So those are my answers for the pop quiz. I'm going to hand it over to David and look forward to your questions later. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Jeanine. I'm glad we got the sharing organized. And
Thank you.
See, do you have slides, David, that need to be shared?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let me find you here.
Thanks, Jeanine. That was interesting.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay.
Actually, you can see in the background, I've got, that's an old gas station in the interior of British Columbia. So I've populated it with some of my documents, but it's kind of an interesting ode to automobility, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And the paradoxes, I'm sorry, this is a subtitle. So the paradoxes that were talked about in Arline and Jeanine's presentation are some of the things I'm going to touch on. I didn't have as much time today to sort of get into this and in the last weekends, because I've been doing departmental stuff. But it's going to be kind of more, it's going to complement the other presentations because it's going to be more of an overview. And it's also going to kind of ask some questions. Well, how would we as a nonprofit society focused on noise and soundscape issues, what might be some future directions that we would want to think about, either in terms of, regulatory approaches, as were mentioned, in pushing for more enforcement, or other approaches. And I'm going to talk today about some maybe complementary alternatives, not to diminish the importance of those approaches. Let me see if I can get my screen larger. Is that larger for you?
It is.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I did also want to acknowledge that I'm working on First Nations territories, the Kwalen, Katsi, Musqueam, Tsawwassen, Semiahmoo, Kikite, and Coquitlam peoples. And if we look at it on a map, it's very interesting, right, in terms of the collage of territorialities. That also makes me think about how our cities, especially in Western Canada, is being kind of younger. I mean, the city I'm living in, New Westminster, is considered the oldest city in Western Canada. And there's a huge automobile space here that's just sort of plunked down territorial. So we're re-territorializing space and place as we grow our cities, right? And this is a huge problem in terms of automobility and the other noises that Arline alluded to, right? The big three being automobility, aircraft, and train or rail traffic. So I'm going to focus on automobility, or what's sometimes called automobility scholars refer to this as car culture, and we also use the term automobility, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. The point being that, as you may have heard, the populations of the planet, right, now am I getting it mixed up? Is 8 billion or 9 billion? Did anyone hear? This is my quiz. Was it 8 billion or 9 billion that we just passed in November, mid-November? It's that bad. Order of
Either
magnitude.
one is bad. Either one is bad.
Either
I
one
think
is bad.
It was 8.
Yes.
Thank
it
you.
was 8.
8 billion, right?
Yeah.
Mid-November, supposedly we reached that point, right? And in terms of cars, this is very interesting. There's actually a debate because we don't really know how many operational cars there are versus as you saw in this previous image, dilapidated cars on the right side of the junkyard. But the point is, so there are these debates, and as our anthropogenic population increases, so does our technological population of automobile artifacts. So the question is, do we have 2 billion cars or 1 billion cars? The magazine on the left, actually from Current Biology, and Gross's piece referred to 2 billion. John Urey, who's a scholar, the late John Urey, who was a scholar of automobility, used the term 1 billion, or nearly approaching 1 billion, and that was in 2004. So there's a kind of floating population. I like taking pictures of cars so I can think about a different kind of city. I don't own a car, actually. My boyfriend just sold his SUV. He moved from Alberta, and I said, "You brought an SUV from Alberta. What's this all about?" So eventually he got rid of it, and we use transit. But and we try to bike and walk. But automobility is a key driver of urban noise. And this picture was taken. This is a transfer point for cars entering North America, and these are all new cars, basically fresh off the boat, next to the Fraser River, which is a major intermodal port. Those cars are then transferred onto trains and sent mostly into the United States. So we get this double noise effect. We get a triple, actually. We get the boats coming up the Fraser River to the port. We get the removal of cars from the boats onto this giant space. It's a huge territory, right? It looks like it takes up the equivalent of all of downtown New Westminster. And then we get the pollutants, the related pollutants, the diesel, the neurotoxins from the boat. You get the most of these are internal combustion engines. Very few of them are electric. And then these cars are then transferred onto trains. So we get train traffic late in the evening, which is very noisy as well, right? And then those vehicles circulate on our roads, continuing to pollute, both in terms of carbon and other pollutants, including noise pollutants. So the question is, this kind of model, how do we address this, right? One geographer, Don Mitchell, comes up with an interesting observation. And I took this picture in South Vancouver. I was riding along, and there was this sort of, in quotes, dead car. And someone had put on their bulletproof. I don't know if they were promoting the car, or I didn't really test the glass, but I found it kind of interesting, right? But Don Mitchell uses this term, the SUV model of citizenship, right? So if we're going to tackle noise pollution from automobiles, we're not just talking about cars, we're talking about, especially in Canada, increasingly trucks, heavily polluting SUVs and trucks, right? In fact, Canada's fleet, according to Barry Sassafrage from the National Observer, is the most polluting in the world. We have the highest rate of emissions from vehicles on a per capita basis in the OECD. Right, and that would also, I haven't done a correlation or looked at correlations with noise pollution, but many of those big vehicles are actually quite polluting. So, but this isn't just a problem in the United States, in Canada, East Coast, West Coast, whatever. It's also a problem in the emergent automobile markets of the global South, right? And so as an urban planner, I did some postdoc research in India. I actually took this picture down in the bottom left-hand corner there. And it was, we were looking at urban infrastructure in various parts of India, both in Delhi and Bengaluru. And in Bangalore, I saw this very interesting thing where new infrastructure was just simply being built for middle-class drivers under certain assumptions, right? Like this road was a good example. There were no sidewalks on this road. It was just simply built for car culture, right? We interviewed residents along here. There was a woman who slipped into, a sewer and completely injured herself. There's all these kinds of crazy stories. So as these new infrastructures for automobility get installed, it increases and ramifies noise problems in our neighborhoods. So, I don't have to go over this for you. Most of you, including scholars like Arline, are very renowned for this work. But what it does is remind us of the impacts of these different urban activities, right? And so the noise pollution is one of the issues that we look at in our society, but we're also interested in this idea of soundscaping, right? Going back to R. Murray Schafer's work and Barry Truax's work at Hildegard Westcamp's work at SFU, right? And so this idea of how do we address this? The question, the very points that Arline raised in terms of a regulatory approach. I'm interested, as an urban planner, I'm interested in also soundscaping and soundscape design as well, right? So the combination, I think, of regulations, of incentives, disincentives, of good urban design and soundscape design is, I think we have to go at it from multiple angles, right? And one of the issues that's been mentioned already, actually, I also use the Streets blog from NYC, right? Is this sort of rise, and I remember when I was a teenager, muscle cars were around too, right? On the prairies of Canada. So it's a cyclical thing, I think. It just comes in new forms, right? Old wine, new bottles. And so for whatever reason, I'm actually interested in this car culture question. What is it that drives especially young males to sort of obsess about this? So it's some of the fetishization of automobility in our culture, but it's also a problem because if we look at, say, Metro Vancouver, a lot of this is occurring in the fast-growing suburbs, which are very automobile-oriented, right? And new migrant communities, they might not feel necessarily empowered to report this to the police. They may not want the implications of reporting it or whatever concerns there are, right? So I think the issue of noise sensors and noise cameras, raises interesting questions. This becomes, so the legal treatment, and actually car fanatics are looking at this. I was just reading this, something called Torque News, right? You can bet that they're not fans of Right to Quiet, right? Torque News is all about, how to improve the performance of your car and, hobbyists and so on. And they, in fact, were proposing some legislation with an acronym for hobbyists, right? But the legislation, they're paying attention, right? And as Arline suggested, there's actually some very interesting legislation. I haven't had time to sort of go into this in any depth, but I noticed just scanning the web that New York State and California are both proposing or have actually approved, in New York's case, I don't know about California, have approved legislation for sound cameras, right? And so for further regulation. So that's fine, but we often know that regulations, as Arline said, can be good on paper, but what can we really do, right? So I also like this idea of citizen science, citizen noise pollution monitoring. I get my students, I think I talked about this last year or earlier in the year, getting my students out in parks, right? So this is something that perhaps can be done at the citizen level, i.e. with our smartphones, perhaps, in terms of, just talking about maybe noisy areas or districts, if we're talking about sonic livability and soundscape planning. The other one is sort of the technological approach, which is happening in Europe. This is the NEMO project, and I think it looks quite promising from what we're seeing, because it not only looks at noise, it also looks at air pollution, right? So that combination, and as we know with the internal combustion engine, the two are integrally related, right? So what's happening with what's happening is that you're getting these enthusiasts, especially I know in suburban Vancouver, like in places like Surrey and Langley, enthusiasts are modifying mufflers to make them sound, to create unique sound effects and to create very kind of troubling sound effects. Interestingly, we also see that in some cases, police have used sound cannons against protesters, right? We know this with the Dakota pipeline protests and so on, right? So there's an interesting, you know, what's happening is we as the lay public, as the general public, are involved in this war, almost this noise war, right? And then just the ambient noise soundscape tends to increase. So we need solutions like this, I think. This is the way of the future. This, by the way, stands for Noise and Emissions Monitoring and Radical Mitigation. Actually, the acronym doesn't make sense, but anyway, I like that, radical mitigation. Okay, so just to sort of wrap this up and move towards some conclusions here, this idea of designing soundscapes, I think, is very important. We heard last year from colleagues from Europe, we're talking about this, and I think that there's a lot of promising ways to involve citizens, right? That way, in many ways, as Jane Jacobs, you know, the consummate New York and Toronto urbanist said, eyes on the street are better than the cops on the beat. Right. And so in that sense, and it's not turning our neighbors and friends into, you know, kind of some nanny state or some, you know, Provodnik policing or something like that, but rather I think it's just more what we would call a common soundscapes, common sense soundscapes, right? Just to bring it closer to home, there's 2 slides here about a current issue, because it is very context specific, right? We're talking about more of an urban, high density canyon-like morphology, say in Manhattan or even parts of Brooklyn, versus you know, more moderate density in, say, some parts of Brooklyn like Williamsburg, versus, say, the West End, high density West End, versus more moderate or even very low density on the West Side or Kitsilano, or in other suburban parts of Metro Vancouver. Those are very different soundscape contexts, and they would require very different solutions in many sense from an urban soundscaping perspective. So this issue that I'm showing you here is the recent Parks Board decision to remove the bike lane on the 2-way, 1-way street, which you know, the Park Drive, which circles Stanley Park. This decision was just made yesterday, and to me, it's a very retrograde step, because it was instituted during the pandemic, where cyclists could continue to ride. Well, at this point on the sign shows that the seawall was closed, but later on, the seawall was open to cyclists and pedestrians and rollerbladers and so on. And they also converted the park road to half of the road. There's 2 lanes going one way. They converted half of the road to a bike lane. And, you know, riding on that as a, you know, I'm not some sports elite cyclist or anything like that. I found it really enjoyable, except for the hill was very good exercise, but let's say that. But I think riding on that in terms of the soundscape, in terms of the pleasure going through the park was one thing, but it also makes you think that what is Stanley Park about? Is it about a park for protecting biodiversity and cultural values, or is it a parking lot which generates revenue for the park board, right? So it raises these kind of questions. The other question about solutions, the question of solutions, some people say, well, you know, all of these technologies might be helpful, sound cameras and you know, soundscaping and citizen science and so on. But you know, our cities will become very quiet once all these EVs come rolling out. And as my colleague Jeanine knows, that's probably not going to be the case, right? There's very Jeanine can talk about this more perhaps in the Q&A here, but there are serious questions about the overall environmental impacts of electric vehicles, right, or battery operated electric vehicles. Are they actually going to reduce our carbon footprint, or is it simply, as Neil Brenner and his students at Harvard, if he used to be with City University, I think, or no, which university was that? Anyway, he was on Stony Brook. Brenner's and his students have looked at the shift in you know, in environmental implications as we move to battery electric vehicles, right? So basically they're concluding it's not a panacea, right? So part of this is to get people out of their cars, to redesign our cities so that they're more walkable, to, you know, have a kind of eco density, or, you know, just forms of density. But the bigger issue is who's living along these streets, right? And who's going to really have a stake in this. So one approach to look at that we could use to look at this, or that I would like to use to consider this, or to raise questions, is a mobilities justice question, right? So if we're talking about policing the streets, Stefano Bloch has an interesting thing talking about policing car space and the legal liminality of the automobile, right? And oftentimes the so-called victim of this policing has been BIPOC communities, right? And who are already, facing a lot of issues. So this raises interesting questions, but it also, sort of forces us to think, what are some other justice issues? Maybe we need to provide better transit systems. Maybe we need to provide more, more forms of livability where people have a stake in their system. And so one way of doing research that I've talked about before, working with my students, is looking at, it's a kind of qualitative approach, looking at automobility and spatial justice, right? From not from the driver's perspective to reify driving. I'm not a driver myself, but to understand, why is it that people want to modify their cars to create these kinds of sounds? I mean, I know we need to address the problem because it's problematic, but why do we keep getting generation after generation of new sound impacts? Maybe that's one way to look at it as well. And how do, from an agency perspective, both in terms of policy and policing, from especially as you've heard me say, from a pedestrian and residents perspective, those are super important ways of looking at automobility and on all the other kinds of sound implications. So the final slide here, we've been talking about in these previous two presentations and in mine, the implications of car cultures and especially technological modifications to mufflers, to various pipes, tailpipes, intermediate pipes. And what does this mean in terms of livability for our soundscape? What does it mean for policing and spatial justice? I'm sort of asking these questions. What are some possible solutions and remedies, as Arline uses the term remedies, right? Some legal remedies might be abetted through technological solutions like the noise cameras, or like the type that I just mentioned in the NEMO in Europe, especially if it can simultaneously, and I think the strength of that is it can simultaneously address air pollution or perhaps even carbon issues, right? Some solutions may come through electric vehicles, but let's face the reality. It's going to happen slowly, probably, and it needs. We also then, as sound advocates or soundscape advocates and quiet space advocates, need to think about the rollout of electric vehicles, because there's a legislative Overton window, because those electric vehicles will, some of them are often having an artificial sound being added to them, because the claim is that, oh, people are not able to be cognizant of them in their environment, so they need sounds. So the question then is, are they all going to have like different fob type sounds or something? So what are some other solutions? Well, one that I thought about a little bit is something like they have in California, where they have the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Los Angeles, or we used to have something in BC called Air Care. So when you do the annual inspection of the vehicle for pollutants, you also could inspect it for sound, right? And if you get your sticker, if you're not polluting and you haven't modified the muffler, and obviously there would still be other kinds of spot enforcement. Another thing is the more integration, not just with pollution, but with other groups that are fighting for safety, road safety, right? We have Vision Zero movements all over the world, right? The Norwegians are way ahead on the curve on this. I think they had 0 accidents in Oslo, 0 road deaths in a city like Oslo, which is amazing, right? It's the largest city in Norway and the capital. And so by focusing on safety, not just from oral safety, not just our hearing safety, but also road safety, we can also, I think our movement can be stronger. So building alliances with pro-pedestrian, pro-road safety, pro-complete streets. Complete streets is the final thing in that list. And the complete streets movement is talking about, hey, we need to share the streets, slow down the traffic, right? Under 30 miles or 30 kilometers per hour is the sort of the safe driving, and once you slow down the speed, you also reduce the ground reflectivity in the sound, right, from the tires and the engine. So integrated planning approaches, integrated movement approaches, looking at infrastructure from a justice perspective and mobilities from a justice perspective. I think if we combine that with our agenda to push for stronger soundscapes, and with very specific pinpoint studies, like our colleague Arline has articulated, will hopefully get us towards a more livable and quieter city.
Thank you, David. Okay, I think the main problem, David, is we don't have enough white horses anymore. And by that, I mean, you know, the young men used to ride on their white horses and slowly go by and kind of attract the women and see if they'd kind of follow them. Now they get their cars and they just race by and they don't have time to look at them or talk with them anymore. You talk a lot about new noise impacts. We seem to be repeating and having more and more noise. I know for being an arborist that if we have trees, there's a theory that if you have big wide open streets, people can see it's safer and they slow down. It's complete opposite. If you have treed streets with lots of vegetation, people slow down because they're not sure if somebody's going to pop out or run out. So there's my vote for trees and quietness. I'll open the floor up to questions to any one of our three speakers.
Can I say something?
Hildegard, yes, go ahead.
Hi.
Sure.
I'm very glad to be here. It's been years.
welcome.
Arline, yes,
40
thank you
years.
for your presentation. We've seen each other, well, it's been years. And I think,
No,
Arline,
hi.
I think we've known each other since the 90s. And Jeanine, nice to meet you. And David, I think I've heard of you through my colleague Milena. I'm not sure, but or I've heard you speak before. I just wanted to thank you, all of you, for your presentations. And I think the thing that has struck me over the years is that it is a circular problem. As the generations grow up, there's new ways of speaking through noise and expressing themselves through whatever tools there are. The word bubble came up as in the context of the what is it called, the SUV. I think it's a very similar image as the bubble under headphones or under noise reduction, noise cancellation headphones that are so popular now among people. And I think these bubbles speak to the fact that the relationship between our environment and ourselves is disrupted through these bubbles, and that we're actually closing off our perception towards the environment. And from my perspective, that's always been the biggest issue. And I just wonder whether you want to address that, because we've been doing since 2003 here in Vancouver now regularly sound walks for the public. And people are coming back to these sound walks over the years and are beginning to get a relationship to the environment. And I've been, with students and doing workshops as a freelance person, really. And there are these sort of bright moments where people suddenly wake up to their own listening and begin to have a relationship to the environment. And it is a very, very complex issue, how we relate to the soundscape and to noise. And that complexity is, I think that's why this repetitive thing of these things reoccurring has to do with the complexity of our hearing sense and the environment. And I could ramble on and on about what's changed between the pandemic, where there was a sort of aha moment for many people, to what is it like when suddenly the environment is quiet, and what happens to our perception, what happens to our relationship to it. And I'm just wondering whether any one of you want to comment on that a bit. And I've always wondered, how can one integrate the amazing work that's been done among noise specialists over the years, the studies that have been done, and that kind of perceptual groundwork of waking up people's ears?
Tough question.
One of our three presenters want to respond?
I can. May
Sure,
I?
yes.
Arline,
Hi, we haven't seen each other in a long time. Let me tell you, I have found that the pandemic did indeed open up our ears to quiet. I've written several articles on that people began to hear birds singing, began to hear the waves along the water shores. And so I hope that this might cause them to wish to join groups to lessen the noise. But from my perspective, the numbers of organizations that are now combating noise have increased. Aircraft noise groups are all over the United States, many of them. And I do serve as an honorary chair on quiet communities on a committee that deals with aircraft noise. So I do think there's a greater awareness that quiet is important. I do suggest that you go to the Quiet Coalition and look at the blog that I wrote about Gordon Hempton's work on quiet in parks. And he calls noise areas dumb environments. I thought that was a wonderful phrase he came up with. So I'm going to be a little more optimistic, and that there's a greater awareness amongst many more groups in the US, in Canada, in Europe, that noise is intrusive on our health. Have we reached the point where we are doing all we can? No. In the United States, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, still calls noise an annoyance, not a health hazard. But I think that there is some hope, and that more people are now advocating for greater quiet and less noise. Let me give the people on now some information. New York City Department of Environmental Protection has developed curricula for school children from the lower grades to the higher grades, teaching them about the dangers of noise, the rewards of quieter environments, and actually asking them to participate in programs that will lower the decibel level. Please go to the sound and noise education module. That's all you have to type in, sound and education noise module, and you will find teaching programs for all youngsters on the dangers of noise, the ways to lessen it, and the importance of quiet. And I think we should start with children. I think that's very important. So please, all on this Zoom meeting, go to Sound and Noise Education module and introduce those programs in your community schools so that we educate youngsters, and then maybe they'll come home and give the information to their parents on how important it is to have a quieter, healthier environment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanine.
Hi, I'd like to say a couple of things, if I may. I think your suggestion, Arline, is wonderful. I did read a couple of books that were a little shocking to me. One was called In Pursuit of Silence, Listening for Meaning in a World of Noise by George Prochnik. And what I found so fascinating in that book is that in his exploration, he discovered that there were people who physically pursued noise that was so intense that it rattled the very atoms and molecules of their bodies, and seemed to be a physical preference. I taught college. I taught art in college, and I taught freshmen, and I actually requested that students not use their cell phones while they were in class. Now, this is not major noise, but I'm speaking about a culture, a type of culture that's prevalent. And I actually asked a girl if she was afraid of silence, and she indeed said yes. So I think because everywhere we go, even when we enter a store, if you cannot shop in silence generally, it's everywhere. It's inescapable. And this is quite apart from the immunity or numbness that we feel until we're disrupted by traffic noise or these louder engines and generators. What I'm interested in figuring out is not only the education that you are describing, but also the capacity to find other ways of feeling as though you exist in an alive way in the world, besides insisting on some kind of sound. It just is shocking to me. I've been watching things from the Los Angeles Japan House, and I'm finding that some of their videos, films, and lectures are an educational thing, which is within their culture, about how to be in a forest. Now, we may not all have access to a forest, particularly in a city like New York, where much of it is built up already. And, I would love to hear how any of the speakers have ideas about dealing with structures that already pre-exist and how to work a cultural introduction of appreciation of less noise within the pre-existing structure. If anybody is possibly interested in answering that, I'd love to hear it.
Well,
Thanks.
I don't know. Thank you. It's a great comment. And I also thank you to Hildegard's questions as well, or comments and questions. But I don't know. I mean, having lived in Asia for 15 years, one of the things that I became used to was Asian cities, that is. One of the things that I became used to was sleeping with earplugs every night. And I still continue that tradition here in New Westminster, which New Westminster is just as noisy, if not worse, than some Asian cities, right? It's got pile driving. We're building a replacement bridge for the Petula Bridge. It's got pile driving for the new Bosa condominiums along the waterfront. It's got pile driving for all these condominiums that are going up. It's got trains at every hour of the night, especially the 2 a.m. one in the morning. And then there's this whole I have double glazed windows. So, I mean, I think we can kind of, there's a tendency, maybe it comes from Thatcherism, to sort of go introvert to that era of individual, the SUV bubble that Don Mitchell talks about, right? That Hildegard referred to as the earbudding of a generation, right? I mean, I myself found that was very helpful, because it was just sort of, there's a continuity between putting in earplugs in the night and then in the day putting in earbuds, right? And although I try not to use a mobile phone, but that sense of being mobile in noise is something that I discovered very early on in Asia, because when I first lived in Asia, people in Asia were using mobile phones the way people now use mobile phones in North America. That is, ubiquitously, everyone had one or two, every age group, and so on and so forth. So I think there is something about that's really dangerous, actually, that we're going, not just in a literal sense, depending on the decibel level that people are wearing whatever device they are putting closer into their ears. But the real danger is that they're closing off the outside sensory experience, right? That experiential knowledge. And I don't know. I mean, I think the nature programs where, like what we saw during the pandemic, as was mentioned, is potentially exciting, but also getting out of the city and then seeing how we can re-envision the city, by going to comparative landscapes, by getting into nature. Not everyone has that privilege. So I think that those are some ways. Within cultures, it's hard to say, because I mean, there's so many differences, and contemporary. Are we talking contemporary culture or historical culture? So I'm not sure, but I mean, I think this would be just an interesting line of research, right? To understand differences in cities according to those neighborhoods, of how they perceive sound. I mean, I know, again, the sound walks, I think, is a great way to do that, because it's mobile, it's tactile, it's both artistic and it's empirical, right? You can have a nice decibel graphs and all this kind of thing, but you can also do more of an impressionistic side. And I think that combination of qualitative and quantitative is very important, especially when we're talking about the changing soundscapes in our cities. I see, though, there is also something about the disempowerment of I mean, it's great that there are these groups that Arlene's talking about. I see that there is still this disempowerment, that people don't know what to do. Like maybe if there's a society, then people will go, hey, I'll join that society. They're doing something like that. That's a remedy for my immediate concern, something more introverted. But then with those societies, if they have combined tactics, right? If we're not just addressing noise pollution or deleterious noise, but we're also addressing air pollution and greenhouse gases. And then it makes people think more holistically. And as a planner, I'm really big on that. Like if there's always a gateway to people thinking more holistically, then I think they can feel more empowered.
Yeah, I really agree with that, David. I think we need to see that all that the soundscape is an expression of all our activities. There's nothing else. And so the sounds are made by our life. And so that then refers to everything else. That refers to noise pollution, to all the other environmental issues. And therefore, what's happening in terms of the climate crisis now is the thing that I find very encouraging is that the word listening is actually appearing more and more everywhere, that we have to listen to each other, that we have to listen to the environment, that we have to listen to nature. What I find dangerous is the noise quiet value judgment, that we will never convert anyone to join the anti-noise movement or anything if we are negative about noise, because noise is not always negative. It's a stimulant that people love, and we have to understand why do they love it? Like, what is it in a person that's a need? And we all have. After I spent 3 weeks in a desert, I understood my desire for making sound. It was so quiet that we needed to make sound. It was absolutely a necessity. We needed to sing, we needed to do all sorts of things. That was an interesting experience because we don't have those in the city anymore. But silence can be oppressive. And then the reason is, why is silence oppressive? What do we need to change? Can silence be expansive? When we're not afraid of silence, it can be expansive. It can be not talking on sound walks is inspirational to people. And so when we have a discussion afterwards, all sorts of complicated issues come out about how we perceive the environment. And so I find it very dangerous to talk about noise being bad and quiet being good. That, I think, is one of the things that we have to eliminate.
I want to also point out that there is now an emphasis on the good sounds. The person who asked the question and cited Prochnik's book, and by the way, I know Prochnik, I don't agree with In Pursuit of Silence. I would rather say In Pursuit of Quiet, so that the good sounds can be heard. And you are right, music, a child's laughter. There are so many good sounds. Noise now tends to be defined as those sounds that are affecting our health and well-being adversely. Sound and noise are different. And Antonella Radici has written quite a bit about soundscapes. And when she was in New York for several months, she led groups of people through our parks. By the way, New York City has many parks in all the boroughs, and they are relatively quiet so that you can hear the good sounds, except when the planes fly over. So let's put that aside. So I think people like Antonella Radici and her work on soundscapes are beginning to focus on the wonderful sounds that really enrich our lives. And unfortunately, they won't be there to enrich our lives if the noise drowns them out. Also, do look at the work of Gordon Hempton. Do look at Quiet Parks International, on which I serve as an advisor. So if anyone wants to contact me, I can give you the names of groups and individuals that are focusing on the quiet and the good sounds. And I have a 4-month-old great-grandchild, and I can't wait to hear her utter her first word. And when I visit her and I hear her sounds coming from her mouth, that's music to my ears.
I would like to just insert one more thing. And speaking of music, yes, what is music to our ears? In the context of the climate crisis, when I watch nature films now, we have gazillions of beautiful nature films that show us nature visually,
Right.
but the soundtrack is always music. The actual filmmakers do not expose us in the same way to the soundscape of what we see. And in that context, music is noise to me. It drives me absolutely bonkers, because in this climate crisis situation, there's such an educational opportunity to bring people closer to the soundscapes of nature, and to attract people to
Agree.
go into nature orally, right? And I think, to me, it's just criminal, actually, that it gets covered up by music that has no relationship to what we're seeing. And that's the same SUV bubble. We drive through the landscape, we have music on. We walk with headphones with music on. There's a conditioning there that comes directly from the Music Corporation. It's a corporate influence that we've all been influenced by. And so in this context of the climate crisis, I think we need to actually learn a practice of listening, along with all the fabulous work that is being done in the field of soundscape and noise studies, and everything that David, Jeanine, and Arline, you've been doing. That somehow, to me, has to be a parallel waking up of our perception.
It's been a very stimulating program and discussion. Are there any last questions before from any of the audience? We've
I have one. I'm just wondering if it's possible to have a platform, a group, or a structure that offers strategies for the control of negative sound or destructive sound. I don't think that it's, people, when they slow down enough to listen, always certainly enjoy the so-called good sounds. I think that's natural. I think we are partial to those. But, I've lived below drummers in my time. I had a space once where I was literally surrounded by drummers above me and below me, and they would play in the night when I had to get up early in the morning to get to work. There is no solution to that. That is, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that no one ever objected, never was called on for being quieter. There was never a police, no cop ever came and knocked on my door because I was quiet. No, and I would never play things in the middle of the night, that's for sure. But that's one of the things that's strange. When you're among a group of people, there is a tendency to have less disruptive reflection and interaction through. I'd rather err on the side of quiet than I would on the side of noise. That's all I'm saying. And among people, unless you're gathered for the purpose of sound, it seems more natural to me to have that among groups of people. That's all I'm gonna say. Anybody have strategies for how to get noise quieter in unpleasant circumstances?
Well, one of the strategies that we have been using is to have a practice of listening. And so when you do have a regular practice of, let's say, sound walks or listening, is that you've tried to identify the places in a community that are quiet and that are giving an opportunity for a kind of a rejuvenation. And we found that interestingly enough, the sound walks that we've been leading, they don't always go through only quiet environments. They go through a rhythm of, you know, sound and quiet as it is in the city. And we've been trying to compose the sound walks in the way that there's a rhythm between quiet and sound, and that we begin to understand what works for us and what doesn't work. And I think these discussions afterwards are really the most important parts of the sound walks. I find is that exchange between people is a platform from where one can find inspiration in terms of how to design environments differently, even if it's just at home. But it can go from the spectrum of one's private life to urban design, or much federal design about aircraft noise or whatever. I mean, one can include any one of those aspects. And it's that exchange between listeners that have just been spending an hour together, not talking, but experiencing the environment as they have, like as if they were in a concert. And that discussion afterwards is quite transformative. So I don't know, are you in Vancouver, Phyllis?
Oh, no, I'm in New York City.
Oh, well, come to Vancouver.
Well,
and come to
Oh, wait a second. If you're in New York City, are you not familiar with Grow NYC?
Of course, I'm familiar with Grow NYC, and I
Have you
also,
gone to their noise pages? You're familiar with the green
yes, of
mark.
course.
We have instructions there just on what you stipulated. If you go to grownyc.org/noise,
yeah, I've
we
done that.
have directions of how to quiet the world, how to help each individual get quiet in their own lives, and how important it is that you respect others and bring some quiet into their lives. So at Grow NYC, we have brochures that people could send for, and we have publications that deal with noise pollution and quiet. So you're familiar with the Grow NYC publications section on noise.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think, I think the question I'm asking has more to do with strategizing ways to engage government, local government in particular, to be able to allow for that, the very margin that Hildegard is describing, where you can enjoy these kind of sound walks, and which is a personal experience, but to be able to have a premise or a platform or a baseline of noise level, so that whatever it is you wish to do as a group or as an individual, it is not overwhelmed by intrusive noise. That's the goal. That's what I'm asking. I'm asking about a strategy for that.
Well, are you familiar with the Department of Environmental Protection?
Oh, yes.
Have you looked at their sections on this?
Of course I have, and I have also employed them.
Then there's been an effort when when we updated the noise code, and it still needs more updating. It was the Department of Environmental Protection that worked with the City Council and Mayor Bloomberg to come up with ways that we could quiet the city. So efforts were made. By the way, do look at the sound and noise education module.
I shall,
because
no problem.
You've looked at it?
No, I shall look at it.
Let me tell you the wonderful thing about it that may surprise you. It even educates children how to become activists in the real world to lessen noise. That's the update that we just did a few weeks ago. Educating children that they have to, in their communities, take an active role in reducing noise. And I have to compliment DEP for including that.
Okay.
I
It's
love,
amazing.
that-
And anyone could access the curricula worldwide.
Sure.
But imagine educating children to become activists, and they actually have workshops and worksheets instructing them how they can do this. That's a big plus.
I love these, Arline, you're so amazing with your suggestions. Thank you for all of these. And I think that I think basically the long and the short strategy is noticing noise, right? Noticing noise, not just ourselves, but getting officials to notice noise, right? And not just officials, bureaucrats as well, right? So I think that this is something like when the radical planning movement started in the 60s, mostly 60s and 70s, the idea was, work with communities, and that's definitely something that needs to continue to happen. But if we're going to work with politicians, we need to get politicians to go on sound walks. We need politicians get politicians to do, and actually that worked when I used to be with Critical Mass. We used to get politicians who would join Critical Mass. They would go Critical Mass, West Coast thing, and probably in New York now. But it was like cycling activists, right? Pushing for more cycling lanes, all this kind of stuff. And Gregor Robertson, when he was the mayor, came on Critical Mass. Andrea Reimer was always, on Critical Mass. And then these politicians were suddenly they were the mayor and councilors, right? And so suddenly there was a push to put bike lanes in. They didn't have to think about bike lanes. They just knew it intuitively made sense. So that's what we need is our politicians, regardless of their ideology or philosophy, to think that way. The other thing that comes to my mind in a more broad sense, and it's not as specific and perhaps as helpful as what Arlene's suggesting, but is the French scholar Henri Lefebvre did work on rhythm analysis. Rhythm analysis was looking at so many aspects. It really radically rethinks the city, right? It's just this kind of neo-Marxist way of looking at the city. But I think it was his last work. And he really, it's very powerful analytic. It could be combined with some of our work on noise and sound. And I think like my students in Singapore used it as a tool to look at daytime and nighttime rhythms of the city, daytime, nighttime rhythms of workers, daytime, nighttime sounds, right? Light quality, all of the sensory aspects of the city. And so by looking at the rhythm, I think it's sort of what Hildegard was saying is that the individual, if we know our neighbors are going to play the drums or have the stereo going at a certain hour, once we become used to that, we, obviously we may not like it, but rather than say going to war, we might adjust our life around that. One of the things we did in our research in Singapore, we found that notice was incredible as a psychological, it's still on the spectrum, it's not really empowerment, right? But it's like, if I know that they're going to be doing pile driving on the bridge or whatever, they, by giving people notice, you feel like, oh, someone's actually concerned about noise, right? And it makes a huge difference from an agency perspective. So, I mean, those are some basic ones, but I still think that we need to get, as citizens, have more control, especially, I rent. As a renter, I often feel like I have no stake in things because it's like, well, I don't know how long I'll be here, et cetera, right? So I think, how do we get, and that's Lefebvre's work as well, the right to the city. How do we feel we have the right to say something in the city, especially if we're precariously or you're here for a limited time? Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on, Carl.
Just on a positive
well,
note.
Thanks, David. I think we're well over time here. I think we've got to continue on offline this discussion. I think all our presenters did a great job. It was very interesting. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I was just going to also say it was very interesting, and also glad to see that we've made some useful contacts between people in the New York area. But we do have to move on to the rest of the meeting, which is more an administrative function. And so, John,
Bye-bye.
before we go to that, I just want to say that we are most indebted to Jeanine Botta for all the years that she has spent working with and for Right to Quiet. And we're looking forward to a useful relationship after tonight, because she will be leaving the board of directors at the end of this meeting.
Yeah.
And so we all are very, very grateful to her for all of that effort that she has put in. A list just simply begins with a website which was completely rebuilt, several years of editing a noise letter, and this meeting just that we've just had right now. So thank you very much, Jimmy.
Thank you, Jeanine.
Thank
Here,
you.
here, Jeanine.
Yeah, like that.
Yes.
Okay.